The words hit me like a physical blow, sharp and unexpected, cutting through the warm afternoon air of my small kitchen. My 8-year-old grandson Tommy sat cross-legged on the linoleum floor, sorting through a shoebox of old photographs I'd given him to keep busy while I prepared his after-school snack. His innocent question hung between us like a storm cloud, heavy with assumptions I'd never thought to correct. "Why are you so poor, Grandma?" he asked again, his dark eyes wide with genuine curiosity as he held up a faded picture of me standing beside my old Honda Civic, the one with the rust spots and the duct-taped bumper that had served me faithfully for 15 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The peanut butter sandwich I was making seemed to freeze in my hands as I processed what he'd said. Poor. The word echoed in my mind, bouncing off memories and perceptions I thought I'd carefully hidden from the world. I set down the knife and turned to face him, my heart doing something complicated between breaking and swelling with love for this child who saw the world through such clear, unfiltered eyes. Tommy had been staying with me every day after school for the past 2 months, while his mother, my daughter Sarah, worked double shifts at the hospital to pay off her student loans. I looked around my modest kitchen, seeing it suddenly through his 8-year-old perspective. The cabinets were original from 1987, painted a cheerful yellow that had faded to something closer to mustard over the decades. The refrigerator hummed loudly, a loyal appliance that had outlived 3 of my neighbors, newer models. The linoleum beneath our feet bore the scuff marks of countless family gatherings, homework sessions, and midnight snacks shared over 35 years of living in this house. To Tommy, raised in his parents' modern suburban home with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, this must have looked like poverty. "What makes you think I'm poor, sweetheart?" I asked gently, lowering myself into the chair across from him. My knees creaked slightly, a symphony of age that had become as familiar as my morning coffee routine. Tommy looked up from the photograph, his small fingers tracing the edges where the color had begun to fade. He was such a thoughtful child, always observing, always processing the world around him, with an intensity that sometimes startled me. "Well," he began, his voice taking on that serious tone children use when they're trying to explain something important to adults. "Your car is really old and it makes funny noises. And your TV is one of those big fat ones, not like the flat one we have at home. And Mom said you shop at the thrift store for your clothes, and you always use coupons when we go to the grocery store." He paused, then added with the devastating honesty that only children possess, "And your house is really small compared to ours." Each observation was delivered without malice, simply stated facts as he understood them. But they landed on my heart like small stones, each one carrying the weight of choices I'd made deliberately, sacrifices I'd embraced willingly, and a lifestyle I'd chosen for reasons he couldn't possibly comprehend at his age. I had spent the last decade of my life living as simply as possible, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because simplicity had given me something far more valuable than expensive possessions or impressive square footage. "Tommy," I said, reaching across the small table to take his hand in mine, "sometimes things aren't exactly what they seem on the surface." His hand was warm and slightly sticky from the photographs, and I could feel the rapid pulse of his young heart through his wrist. "Would you like to help me with something upstairs? There's a box in my closet that I think you might find interesting." His eyes lit up immediately. Tommy had always been drawn to mysteries, to hidden treasures and secret discoveries. Last month, he'd spent an entire afternoon convinced that the loose floorboard in my hallway was hiding pirate treasure, and I'd let him investigate to his heart's content, watching with delight as his imagination transformed my old house into an adventure story. Now, as we made our way up the narrow staircase, I could practically feel his excitement radiating off him in waves. My bedroom was as modest as the rest of the house, furnished with pieces I'd inherited from my mother and grandmother, solid wood furniture that had weathered decades of use and still stood strong. The quilt on my bed was one I'd sewn myself during the long winter months after my husband passed away 7 years ago, each square carefully chosen from fabric that held memories of dresses I'd worn, curtains that had hung in our first apartment, and shirts that had belonged to my beloved Robert. Tommy watched with fascination as I pulled a wooden chair over to the closet and climbed up to reach the highest shelf. My fingers found the familiar texture of the old hat box I kept pushed far back behind my winter coats, a container that held secrets I'd never shared with anyone, not even Sarah. The box was heavier than it looked, filled with papers and documents that represented a lifetime of careful planning and quiet decisions. "What's in there, Grandma?" Tommy asked, bouncing slightly on his toes with anticipation. I settled the box on my bed and patted the quilt beside me, inviting him to sit close. The afternoon sunlight streamed through my bedroom window, casting golden rectangles across the faded carpet and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air between us. "Well," I said, opening the box slowly for dramatic effect, "this contains some very important papers. Papers that tell a different story than what you might think you know about your grandmother." Inside were bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, and legal documents that I'd accumulated over nearly 4 decades of working as a nurse, then as a nursing supervisor, and finally as a consultant for healthcare facilities across 3 states. Tommy leaned in closer, his curiosity piqued by the official-looking documents. "What are all those numbers?" he asked, pointing to a bank statement that showed a balance I'd never discussed with anyone in my family. His finger traced the digits, his lips moving silently as he tried to make sense of the figures that seemed to dance across the page. "Those numbers," I said carefully, "represent something called savings. Money that I've put away little by little, year after year, instead of spending it on things that other people might think are important." I pulled out another document, this one showing the balance in my investment account, numbers that would have surprised even Sarah if she'd known about them. "You see, Tommy, when I was your age, my grandmother taught me something very valuable. She taught me that real wealth isn't about having the biggest house or the newest car or the fanciest clothes." His brow furrowed in concentration, the way it did when he was working through a particularly challenging math problem at school. "But then why do you drive that old car if you have all this money?" The question was logical, coming from a mind that hadn't yet learned about the complexities of adult choices and the different ways people choose to live their lives. I smiled and pulled out a photograph from deeper in the box, one that showed me standing in front of a small medical clinic in Guatemala, surrounded by children whose eyes held the same brightness as Tommy's, but whose circumstances were vastly different. "This picture was taken 3 years ago," I explained, "when I spent 2 months volunteering at a clinic that serves families who don't have access to basic health care. The money you're looking at in those statements, most of it goes to places like this, to organizations that build schools in places where children have to walk 10 miles to get an education, to food banks that make sure families don't go hungry, to shelters that help women and children who need a safe place to stay." Tommy studied the photograph intently, his young mind processing this new information. "So you give your money away?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like awe. Children have an innate sense of fairness, a natural understanding of generosity that adults sometimes lose along the way, and I could see him working through the implications of what I was telling him. "I give most of it away," I confirmed, "but I also save some of it for important things. Like making sure your mother doesn't have to worry about how she's going to pay for your college education someday. Like having enough put aside so that if there's ever an emergency in our family, we'll be okay. And like being able to leave something meaningful for the people I love when I'm no longer here to take care of them myself." The silence that followed was filled with the soft sounds of late afternoon, the distant hum of traffic, the gentle creaking of the house settling into evening, the whispered rustle of leaves outside my bedroom window. Tommy sat very still beside me, absorbing everything I'd shared, his small hands folded in his lap as he processed this revelation about his grandmother's secret life. "So you're not poor?" he said finally, his voice filled with wonder. "You just pretend to be poor." I laughed softly, the sound mixing relief with a touch of sadness that it had taken this long for anyone in my family to understand the choices I'd made. "I'm not pretending anything, sweetheart. I'm choosing to live simply because it allows me to do things that matter to me. When I buy my clothes at the thrift store, I save hundreds of dollars that can go to help families who don't have any clothes at all. When I drive my old car instead of buying a new one, I save thousands of dollars that can help build a well in a village where people have to walk miles for clean water. Tommy's eyes were wide now, and I could see the wheels turning in his 8-year-old mind as he began to understand that wealth could be measured in ways that had nothing to do with visible possessions. "But why doesn't Mom know about this?" he asked. "Why didn't you tell her about all this money?" It was a fair question, one that cut straight to the heart of decisions I'd made over the years about how to raise my children and what values I wanted to pass on to them. "Your mother thinks she knows," I said carefully. "She knows I have some savings, and she knows I'm comfortable, but I've never told her exactly how much, because I wanted her to learn to work hard and be independent. I wanted her to understand the value of earning her own way in the world, not to grow up expecting that someone else would always take care of everything for her." The afternoon was growing longer, and I could hear the familiar sounds of my neighborhood settling into evening routines. Dogs barking in distant yards, the soft slam of car doors as people returned home from work, the gentle murmur of television sets being turned on in houses up and down my street. These were the sounds that had surrounded me for decades, the soundtrack of a life lived quietly but purposefully. "I want to show you something else," I said, reaching for another folder in the box. This one contained letters, dozens of them, written on different types of paper in various handwritings, some in languages Tommy wouldn't recognize. "These are thank you letters," I explained, "from some of the people and organizations that have received help over the years. This one is from a young woman in Kenya who was able to go to medical school because of a scholarship program I helped support. This one is from a family in Mississippi whose home was rebuilt after a hurricane destroyed everything they owned." Tommy took the letters carefully, handling them with the reverence children reserve for truly important things. He couldn't read all the words, but he could sense the gratitude and joy that radiated from each page. "Wow," he breathed, and in that single word I heard the beginning of understanding, the dawning realization that his grandmother's life was far richer and more complex than he'd ever imagined. "You know what the most amazing part is?" I asked, watching his face.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
As he studied the letters, "When you help other people, when you use your resources to make someone else's life better, you get back something that can't be measured in dollars and cents. You get the knowledge that you've made a difference, that your life has meant something beyond just taking care of yourself." The room grew quiet again as Tommy processed everything I'd shared with him. Outside my window, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting my modest bedroom in shades of gold and amber that transformed the simple space into something almost magical. This was the golden hour that photographers loved, when ordinary things became extraordinary, when simple moments revealed their hidden beauty. "Grandma," Tommy said finally, his voice soft with something that sounded like newfound respect, "I think you might be the richest person I know." His words settled into my heart like a warm embrace, validation from the most honest source I knew that the choices I'd made over the decades had been the right ones. "Wealth isn't always about what you keep, sweetheart," I told him, gathering him into my arms for a hug that smelled like peanut butter and childhood and all the best things in the world. "Sometimes it's about what you're able to give away." As we sat there together on my old quilt, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived purposefully, I realized that this moment was worth more than any possession I could have bought, any luxury I could have afforded, any status symbol I could have displayed. This was the moment when my grandson learned that true richness comes not from accumulating wealth, but from using whatever resources you have to make the world a little bit better than you found it. The conversation with Tommy had opened something inside me that I hadn't realized was closed, a need to share the fuller story of how I'd come to live the way I did. Over the next few days, as he continued to stay with me after school while Sarah worked her double shifts, he asked question after question about my secret life as someone who gave away money instead of spending it on herself. "How did you decide to start doing this?" he asked one afternoon, as we walked through the neighborhood park, his small hand clasped firmly in mine, as we made our way along the familiar path that wound around the old oak trees and past the playground where Sarah had spent countless hours as a child. I thought carefully about how to explain decades of evolution in my thinking, how to distill a lifetime of gradual understanding into something an 8-year-old could grasp. When I was younger, I began. I thought happiness came from having nice things, from keeping up with what everyone else had, from making sure I looked successful on the outside. But after your grandfather died, I started to realize that none of those things really mattered when it came to the big questions in life. Tommy kicked at a pile of fallen leaves, sending them swirling around our feet in a cascade of yellow and brown. "What big questions?" he asked, with the directness that children bring to philosophical discussions, cutting straight through to the heart of complex matters without getting tangled up in adult complications. Questions like, "Did my life make a difference?" And, "Will the world be better because I was here?" I explained. When I was working as a nurse, I saw so much suffering that could have been prevented if people just had access to basic healthcare, clean water, education, safe housing. I started to understand that I had been given opportunities that many people never get, and that maybe my purpose was to use those advantages to help level the playing field for others. We settled onto a bench that overlooked the small pond where ducks gathered to beg for breadcrumbs from park visitors. The water reflected the afternoon sky, creating a mirror image of clouds and blue that seemed to double the beauty of the simple scene. Tommy watched the ducks with fascination, but I could tell he was still processing our conversation, still working through the implications of everything I'd shared with him. "Is that why you became a nurse?" he asked. "To help people?" "Actually," I said, smiling at the memory of my younger self and the naive dreams that had guided my early choices. "I became a nurse because it seemed like a stable job that would always be needed, and because the training program was something I could afford. I didn't start out thinking about changing the world or making a huge difference. Those realizations came later, after I'd spent years taking care of people and seeing how much pain and suffering exists that doesn't have to exist." A family of ducks swam closer to our bench, hoping we might have treats to share. Tommy watched them with delight, counting them out loud and making up stories about their individual personalities. "That one's the father," he announced, pointing to the largest duck, "and he's making sure the babies stay safe while the mother looks for food." His natural tendency to create narratives about the world around him reminded me so much of Sarah at that age, the way she used to turn every ordinary experience into an adventure story. "You know," I said, "that's exactly what your mother used to do when she was little. She could turn a trip to the grocery store into an epic quest, complete with heroes and villains and magical discoveries in the cereal aisle." "Did she know about your money then?" Tommy asked, seamlessly returning to the subject that had been occupying his thoughts since our discovery session in my bedroom. "Did she know you were helping people?" "She knew some of it," I replied carefully. "She knew I volunteered at the free clinic downtown, and she knew I sent money to support your cousin Maria's education in Honduras. But she was busy with her own life, her own challenges, and I didn't want to burden her with the knowledge that there were resources available that might make her feel like she didn't need to work as hard to achieve her goals." The concept seemed to puzzle Tommy, as I'd expected it would. Children haven't yet learned the complicated dance that adults do around money and independence, the delicate balance between helping and enabling, between supporting and interfering. "But wouldn't it have been easier for her if she knew?" he asked with the logical directness that made our conversation such a pleasure. "Easier, yes," I agreed. "But not necessarily better for her in the long run. Your mother is strong and capable and independent because she learned to solve problems and overcome obstacles on her own. If I had stepped in to smooth every rough path for her, she might never have discovered just how resilient and resourceful she really is." As we walked home from the park, Tommy peppered me with more questions about my charitable activities, my investment strategies, and my philosophy about money and happiness. His curiosity was endless and infectious, reminding me of why I had always loved working with children during my nursing career. They approached the world with such openness, such willingness to consider new ideas and challenge their previous assumptions. "Grandma," he said as we turned onto my street, "do you think Mom would be mad if she found out about all your secret money?" It was a question I'd been asking myself ever since our conversation began. one that touched on fears I'd been harboring for years about how my family would react to the full truth about my financial situation. "I don't think she'd be mad exactly," I said slowly, "but she might be hurt that I didn't trust her with the information, or confused about why I made the choices I made." Sometimes when we love people, we make decisions that seem right at the time but that might not make sense to others. That evening, after Tommy had been picked up by his father, and my house had settled back into its familiar quiet, I found myself thinking about our conversation and the questions he'd raised about transparency and trust within our family. I walked through my modest home, seeing it with new eyes, understanding perhaps for the first time how the choices I'd made about how to live might have created misconceptions about who I was and what my circumstances really were. In my living room, I paused in front of the old photograph that hung above my couch, a picture of Robert and me taken on our 25th wedding anniversary. We were standing in front of our first house, a tiny starter home that we'd saved for years to afford, both of us grinning with the pride of homeownership and the joy of a life being built together step by step. Robert had understood my approach to money and giving, had supported my decision to live below our means so that we could contribute more to causes we cared about. But he'd been gone for 7 years now, and I'd been making these decisions alone, without the benefit of a partner who shared my values and could help me think through the implications of my choices. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and settled into my favorite chair, the one that had belonged to my grandmother and still held the faint scent of her lavender perfume after all these years. The house was quiet except for the familiar sounds of evening, the hum of the refrigerator, the gentle tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the distant murmur of television from my neighbor's house next door. As I sipped my tea, I thought about Tommy's innocent question about why I appeared to be poor, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I had allowed my family to develop a narrative about my life that wasn't entirely accurate, not because I'd lied to them, but because I'd been selective about what I chose to share, careful about how much I revealed about my resources and my activities. The next afternoon, when Tommy arrived after school with his backpack full of homework and his head full of questions, I was ready with a new project for us to work on together. "How would you like to help me write some letters?" I asked, settling him at my kitchen table with his favorite snack and a pile of fresh paper and colorful pens. "What kind of letters?" he asked, his interest immediately piqued by the prospect of a new adventure. Tommy had recently learned to write in cursive at school, and he was eager to practice his new skill whenever possible. "Well," I said, settling into the chair across from him, "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about secrets and families, and being honest with the people we love. And I've decided that maybe it's time for me to share more about what I do with some of the important people in my life." Tommy's eyes lit up with understanding. "You're going to tell Mom about the money," he exclaimed, his voice filled with excitement at the prospect of being part of such a significant revelation. "I'm going to tell your mother a lot of things," I confirmed. "About the money, yes, but also about why I made the choices I made, and what I hope she'll understand about the way I've tried to live my life. Would you like to help me figure out how to explain it all?" Over the next hour, Tommy and I worked together to craft a letter that would serve as the beginning of a more honest conversation with my daughter. His questions helped me clarify my own thinking, and his suggestions about what might be confusing or surprising to his mother gave me insight into how my choices might be perceived by someone who had lived with their consequences without understanding their motivation. "You should tell her about the clinic in Guatemala," Tommy suggested, carefully forming each letter as he helped me write a rough draft. "And about the letters from all those people you helped. She needs to know that you're not just keeping the money in a box under your bed." His practical 8-year-old perspective was exactly what I needed to help me think through how to present information that had never been shared, how to explain decisions that had been made in private, how to reveal a side of myself that I'd kept hidden even from the people who loved me most. As the days passed and Tommy continued to stay with me after school, our conversations about money and giving and purpose began to evolve into something deeper. He started to see patterns in the world around him that he'd never noticed before, began to ask questions about inequality and fairness, and what it meant to have enough when others had too little. "Grandma," he said one afternoon as we walked through downtown on our way to the library, "why do some people have to sleep outside when there are empty buildings everywhere?" It was the kind of question that cut straight to the heart of complex social issues, delivered with the moral clarity that children bring to situations that adults have learned to rationalize or ignore. That's one of the big problems that people like me try to help solve, I told him. There are organizations that work to provide housing for people who don't have homes, and some of the money I donate goes to support that kind of work. Could we visit one of those places? He asked, his curiosity extending now beyond just understanding his grandmother's financial situation to wanting to see the actual impact of charitable work. I want to see where your money goes. The request surprised me, but it also filled me with pride. Here was a child who was beginning to understand that money could be a tool for creating positive change, that wealth carried with it both opportunity and responsibility. I think that could be arranged, I said. There is a food bank downtown that I support, and they sometimes give tours to people who want to understand more about their work. That weekend, I called the director of the local food bank and arranged for a visit. Sarah dropped Tommy off at my house early Saturday morning, and together we made the drive to the warehouse district where the food bank operated out of a converted industrial building. Tommy was fascinated by everything he saw, from the enormous refrigeration units that stored donated produce to the assembly line where volunteers packed boxes of groceries for distribution to families in need. We serve about 200 families every week, explained Maria Santos, the volunteer coordinator who gave us our tour. Many of them are working families who just don't earn enough to cover all their expenses, especially when unexpected costs come up like medical bills or car repairs. Tommy listened intently as Maria described the demographics of food insecurity in our community, his young mind processing the reality that people with jobs and homes and children his age sometimes struggled to afford basic necessities. "Do kids come here?" he asked, and I could hear something in his voice that sounded like the beginning of empathy, the dawning recognition that circumstances beyond people's control could create hardship. "Lots of kids," Maria confirmed. "In fact, we have special programs during school holidays, when children who usually rely on free breakfast and lunch at school need extra food at home." On the drive back to my house, Tommy was unusually quiet, processing everything he'd seen and heard. Finally, as we pulled into my driveway, he turned to me with the serious expression that meant he was working through something important. "Grandma," he said, "I think I understand now why you don't need a big fancy house." That evening, as we sat together in my living room working on a jigsaw puzzle that depicted a mountain landscape, Tommy brought up something that had been on my mind as well. "When are you going to give Mom the letter?" he asked, fitting a piece of sky into the puzzle with the concentration that children bring to tasks they consider important. "Soon," I replied. "I want to make sure I've thought through everything I want to say, and I want to be prepared for whatever questions she might have." The truth was, I'd been carrying around the letter we'd written together for several days, reading it over and over, adding to it and revising it as I tried to find the right words to explain decades of decisions and choices. "What if she gets upset?" Tommy asked, voicing the concern that had been keeping me awake at night. "What if she's mad that you didn't tell her before?" It was a valid worry, one that reflected his growing understanding of the complexities of adult relationships, and the ways that well-intentioned secrets could sometimes create hurt feelings or misunderstandings. "She might be upset at first," I acknowledged. "But I think once she understands why I made the choices I made, she'll see that I was trying to do what I thought was best for her and for our family. And if she doesn't understand," Tommy pressed with the persistence that 8-year-olds bring to important questions, "then we'll keep talking until she does." I said simply, "That's what people who love each other do. They work through the hard conversations, and they figure out how to understand each other, even when it takes time and patience." 2 days later, Sarah arrived to pick up Tommy after one of her double shifts, looking tired but relieved to have her work week behind her. She settled into my kitchen chair with a grateful sigh, accepting the cup of coffee I offered and allowing herself a few minutes to decompress before heading home to tackle the weekend's household responsibilities. "Mom," I said, settling into the chair across from her, "there's something I'd like to share with you. Something important that I should have talked to you about a long time ago." Sarah looked up from her coffee with the slightly wary expression that adult children wear when their parents announce they have something significant to discuss. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need help with something?" Her immediate assumption that I might need assistance, rather than that I might have something positive to share, reminded me of how successfully I'd maintained the impression that I was living on a limited fixed income, managing carefully, but without much margin for extras or emergencies. "I'm fine," I assured her quickly. "Actually, I'm more than fine. I'm in a position where I can help you with some things, and I think it's time you knew the full picture of my financial situation." I pulled out the letter that Tommy and I had written together, along with copies of some of the bank statements and investment documents that I'd shown him the previous week. Sarah's eyes widened as she processed the numbers on the pages, her understanding shifting from confusion to amazement as she began to comprehend the scope of what I'd been keeping private. "Mom," she said finally, her voice filled with a mixture of shock and something that might have been hurt. "Why didn't you tell me? All these years I've been worrying about whether you had enough money for your medical expenses, whether you were able to afford repairs on the house, whether you'd be okay if something unexpected happened." Her response was exactly what I'd feared, and exactly what I'd expected. The natural reaction of a loving daughter who had been allowed to carry unnecessary worry because her mother had chosen privacy over transparency. "I didn't tell you," I said carefully, "because I wanted you to build your own strength, your own independence, your own confidence in your ability to handle whatever life threw at you. But I could have spent less time worrying and more time enjoying our relationship," Sarah said, and I could hear the pain in her voice, the hurt that came from feeling excluded from important information about someone she loved. "You're absolutely right," I acknowledged, "and I'm sorry for that. I made a decision that seemed wise to me at the time, but I didn't fully consider how it might affect you to not have the complete picture." Tommy had been sitting quietly at the kitchen counter, working on homework but clearly listening to every word of our conversation. Now he looked up from his math problems, with the serious expression that meant he was about to contribute something important to the discussion. "Mom," he said to Sarah, "you should see all the letters from the people Grandma has helped. And we went to the food bank where some of her money goes, and they help 200 families every week." His intervention shifted the focus of our conversation from the secrecy around my finances to the purpose behind my financial choices, giving Sarah a broader context for understanding why I had accumulated resources and how I had chosen to use them. Over the next 2 hours, we talked through everything I'd been doing with my money, the organizations I supported, the trips I'd taken to see the impact of various charitable programs, and the philosophy that had guided my decisions about living simply so that I could give generously. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Sarah said finally, reaching across the table to take my hand in hers. "I'm proud of the work you've done, and the lives you've touched, and the difference you've made. I just wish I had known sooner, so that I could have been part of it, so that I could have shared in something that obviously means so much to you." Her words released something that had been tightly held inside me for years, the fear that my choices would be misunderstood or criticized, that my family would see my charitable activities as irresponsible, or my simple lifestyle as evidence of financial limitation rather than conscious choice. "There's no reason you can't be part of it now," I said. "In fact, there are some things I'd love to have your help with, some decisions I'd appreciate your input on." That conversation was the beginning of a new chapter in our family's story, one in which my resources became tools for bringing us closer together rather than secrets that created distance between us. Over the following months, Sarah began to accompany me on some of my volunteer activities. Tommy started a savings account where he could set aside money for charitable donations, and we developed new traditions around giving that involved the whole family in decisions about how to use financial resources to create positive change. The revelation about my financial situation also opened up conversations about values and priorities that had been difficult to have when my family didn't understand the full context of my choices. Sarah began to see that my old car and modest house and thrift store clothes weren't evidence of limitation, but expressions of freedom, symbols of a life lived according to principles rather than appearances. "I think I understand now why you live the way you do," she told me one evening as we worked together in my kitchen, preparing a meal for the family of a neighbor who had just returned from the hospital. "When you don't feel like you need to impress people with your possessions, you have so much more energy and resources available for the things that really matter." Tommy, who had become my co-conspirator in various charitable projects, nodded seriously from his position at the counter, where he was carefully measuring ingredients for the dessert we were contributing to the meal. "And it's more fun to help people than to buy stuff," he added with the wisdom of someone who had discovered the joy of making a difference in the world. As I looked around my kitchen that evening, watching my daughter and grandson work alongside me to create something that would bring comfort to someone else, I realized that Tommy's innocent question about why I was poor had led to something far more valuable than he could have imagined. It had led to honesty, to understanding, to shared purpose, and to the beginning of a family legacy built around the idea that true wealth comes not from what we accumulate for ourselves, but from what we're able to give to others. The story of my secret bank account had become the story of how a family learned to measure richness not in dollars and possessions but in opportunities to make the world a little bit better, one act of generosity at a time. And perhaps most importantly, it had become the story of how an 8-year-old's curiosity had opened the door to conversations that transformed the way we understood ourselves, each other, and our responsibility to use whatever resources we had been given in service of something larger than our own comfort and security. The weeks following our family revelation brought changes I hadn't anticipated, shifts in dynamics that rippled through our daily routines like stones thrown into still water. Tommy's newfound understanding of my financial situation had ignited something in him, a curiosity about money and giving that went far beyond his 8-year-old world of allowances and birthday gifts. He started asking questions that challenged even my own thinking, observations that forced me to examine motivations I'd never fully articulated even to myself. "Grandma," he said one Thursday afternoon as we sorted through mail at my kitchen table, "if you have so much money that you can help all those people, why don't you help even more people? Why don't you give away everything except what you need to eat and live?" His question hung in the air between us like a philosophical puzzle, the kind of moral inquiry that cuts straight to the heart of ethical decision-making without the complications that adults usually add to such discussions. I set down the stack of envelopes I'd been sorting and looked at his earnest face, seeing in his expression the same intensity he brought to difficult math problems at school. "That's a really good question," I said slowly, buying myself time to formulate an answer that would satisfy his logical young mind without overwhelming him with complexities he wasn't ready to understand. "I suppose it comes down to balance. If I gave away absolutely everything, I wouldn't be able to continue helping people over time. I need to keep enough to maintain my health, my home, and my ability to earn money that I can then donate to causes I care about." Tommy nodded thoughtfully, but I could see he wasn't entirely satisfied with my explanation. "But what about your car?" he pressed. "You could sell that old car and buy an even older one, and then you'd have more money to give away." His persistence reminded me so much of Sarah at that age, the way she used to dissect every rule and expectation until she understood not just what was expected of her, but why it was expected. "You're right that I could probably live more simply than I do," I acknowledged, "but I've found that if I make my life too uncomfortable or too restrictive, I start to feel resentful about giving, and that changes the spirit in which I help others." This seemed to make sense to him, and he returned to his homework with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully worked through a complex problem. But his questions had stirred something in me, a restlessness about whether I was truly living up to my own principles, whether the balance I'd struck between personal comfort and charitable giving was the right one. That evening, after Tommy had been picked up by his father, I found myself walking through my house with new eyes, seeing my possessions and choices through the lens of his relentless logic. The television in my living room was indeed old and bulky, as he'd observed, but it worked perfectly well for my needs. The furniture was worn but comfortable, chosen for durability rather than style. My clothes were a mixture of thrift store finds and a few quality pieces I'd owned for years, practical rather than fashionable. By most measures, I was living quite modestly. But Tommy's questions had made me wonder whether modesty was the same as responsibility, whether my comfort with my current lifestyle was a sign of wisdom or a rationalization for keeping more than I truly needed. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to my door. Elena Rodriguez stood on my front porch holding a covered casserole dish and wearing the nervous expression of someone who wasn't sure whether she was welcome. Elena lived 3 houses down from me, a single mother of 2 young children who worked multiple part-time jobs to make ends meet. I'd helped her family quietly over the years, anonymously paying an electric bill here and there when I knew money was particularly tight, leaving grocery gift cards in her mailbox without signing my name. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, her voice carrying the hesitation of someone who wasn't accustomed to asking for help. "I hope it's okay that I came by. I wanted to thank you for something, but I wasn't sure how to do it without seeming presumptuous." I invited her in, curious about what had prompted this visit. Elena had never acknowledged my anonymous assistance before, and I'd assumed she either didn't know the source of the occasional help or chose not to mention it out of pride. We settled in my living room, the casserole dish balanced on her knees as she gathered her thoughts. "My daughter Carmen mentioned that your grandson Tommy told her at school about some charity work you do," she began, her words careful and measured. "And it got me thinking about some things that have happened over the past few years. Times when help showed up just when we needed it most, and I started to wonder." Her voice trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Somehow, the web of secrecy I'd maintained around my charitable activities was beginning to unravel, and people were starting to connect dots they'd previously ignored. "Carmen said Tommy told her you help people who don't have enough money," Elena continued. "And I remembered the time 2 years ago when someone paid our electric bill anonymously, and last Christmas when gift cards appeared in our mailbox with no name attached." I felt heat rise in my cheeks, the uncomfortable sensation of being discovered in acts I'd intended to keep private. "Elena," I said gently, "if someone helped your family during difficult times, I'm sure they did it because they cared about you and your children, not because they expected recognition or thanks." She smiled then, an expression that transformed her worried face into something radiant. "I know," she said, "but I wanted you to know that whoever that someone was, their kindness made the difference between us staying in our home and having to move somewhere we couldn't afford. Carmen and Miguel were able to stay in their school, keep their friends, maintain some stability during a really hard time." The conversation continued for another hour, Elena sharing stories about the impact of anonymous help on her family's life, the way unexpected assistance had arrived precisely when they needed it most. Her gratitude was overwhelming and humbling, forcing me to confront the reality that my attempts to help people without recognition hadn't been as invisible as I'd believed. After Elena left, I sat in my kitchen staring at the casserole she'd brought, a gesture of reciprocity that represented far more than a simple thank you meal. She had used her limited resources to acknowledge kindness, demonstrating the same spirit of giving that motivated my own charitable activities, just on a much smaller scale and with much greater personal sacrifice. That afternoon, when Tommy arrived for his usual after-school stay, I was ready with a new project for us to work on together. "How would you feel about helping me research some organizations that help families right here in our own community?" I asked, settling him at my kitchen table with his favorite snack and my laptop computer. His eyes lit up with interest. "Like the food bank we visited?" he asked, already reaching for the computer with the enthusiasm of someone who loved any excuse to use technology for a purpose beyond games or entertainment. "Exactly like that," I confirmed. "I've been thinking about your questions yesterday, about whether I'm doing enough to help people, and I realized that maybe I should look more carefully at the needs that exist right here in our own neighborhood." Over the next 2 hours, Tommy and I researched local nonprofits, reading about their missions and programs, looking at their financial information to understand how efficiently they use donations, discussing which causes resonated most strongly with both of us. His questions and observations helped me see familiar organizations from new perspectives, and his excitement about the prospect of making a direct impact in our own community was infectious. "Look at this one, Grandma," he said, pointing to a website for an after-school tutoring program that served children from low-income families. "It says they help kids with their homework and teach them computer skills, but they need more volunteers and more money for supplies." The program operated out of a community center less than 2 miles from my house, in a neighborhood where many families struggled with the same challenges Elena faced, working multiple jobs while trying to provide their children with educational opportunities and enrichment activities. "That looks like something we could visit," I said. "Would you like to call and see if they give tours?" The following Saturday, Tommy and I drove to the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Center, a brick building that had clearly seen better days but buzzed with energy and purpose. Inside, children of all ages worked at tables scattered throughout a large multi-purpose room, some focused intently on homework assignments, while others participated in art projects or learned basic computer skills on older but functional machines. Maria Gonzalez, the program director, greeted us with the warm enthusiasm of someone genuinely passionate about her work. "We serve about 60 children every day after school," she explained as she led us through the facility. "Most of their parents work service jobs with irregular hours, so the kids need a safe place to go where they can get help with homework and participate in enriching activities." Tommy was fascinated by everything he saw, from the small library of donated books to the kitchen, where volunteers prepared healthy snacks for the children. "Do the kids like coming here?" he asked Maria, with the directness that children use when they want to understand whether something is truly beneficial rather than just supposedly good for people. "They love it," Maria replied. "For many of them, this is the only place where they get one-on-one attention with their schoolwork, where someone notices if they're struggling with a concept or celebrates when they master something difficult." As we toured the facility, I found myself mentally calculating how much it would cost to upgrade their computer equipment, expand their library, or provide scholarships for children to attend summer enrichment programs. The math was simple, the impact would be immediate and measurable, and the connection to my own community made the opportunity feel especially meaningful. "What would be most helpful right now?" I asked Maria as our tour concluded. "If someone wanted to support your program, what would make the biggest difference for the children you serve?" Maria's eyes widened slightly, as if she wasn't accustomed to such direct offers of assistance. "Honestly," she said, "we need everything. New computers, more books, supplies for our art programs, funding for field trips, money to pay for additional tutors. We operate on such a tight budget that any support would be transformative." On the drive home, Tommy was unusually quiet, processing everything he'd seen and heard. Finally, as we turned onto my street, he spoke up with the thoughtful tone he used when working through important ideas. "Grandma," he said, "I think you should help that place. Those kids need what you have to give." His simple assessment cut straight to the heart of what I'd been feeling during our visit, the recognition that this was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been unconsciously searching for, a way to use my resources to make a tangible difference in the lives of children who reminded me of my own grandchildren at that age. That evening, I called Maria and arranged a meeting to discuss how I might support their program. Our conversation revealed needs I hadn't fully grasped during our tour, challenges that went beyond funding to include volunteer recruitment, community outreach, and long-term sustainability planning. "What if," I suggested, "instead of just making a one-time donation, I helped you develop a more comprehensive approach to fundraising and community support? I have some experience with nonprofit work, and I might be able to help you connect with other potential donors and volunteers." Maria's response was enthusiastic but cautious, the reaction of someone who had learned not to expect too much from well-meaning offers that might not materialize into sustained commitment. "That would be amazing," she said, "but I want to make sure you understand what you'd be getting into. This kind of work requires ongoing involvement, regular meetings, lots of coordination with other community members, who all have different ideas about priorities and approaches." Her honesty was refreshing and reassuring, indicating that she understood the difference between momentary generosity and sustained partnership. "I think that's exactly what I'm looking for," I told her. "I've spent years writing checks to organizations I never visit, supporting causes I never see up close. I'd like to try a more hands-on approach." Our partnership began the following week with a meeting that included Maria, 2 other community center staff members, and 3 parent volunteers who helped coordinate various aspects of the after-school program. I arrived prepared with research I'd done on successful funding models for similar programs, examples of grant opportunities we might pursue, and ideas for community engagement strategies that could expand both financial support and volunteer participation. The meeting lasted 3 hours and covered everything from immediate needs like computer upgrades to long-term goals like expanding programming to serve more children during summer months. By the end of our discussion, I had committed to funding several specific improvements and agreed to lead a committee focused on developing sustainable funding sources for ongoing operations. "Mrs. Patterson," said Carmen Ruiz, one of the parent volunteers, "I have to ask, why are you doing this? What made you decide to get so involved with our program?" It was a fair question, one that deserved an honest answer. My grandson asked me recently why I don't do more to help people, I said. And I realized that while I've been giving money to various causes for years, I haven't been giving much of myself. I want to see the impact of my contributions, to build relationships with the people I'm trying to help, to be part of a community working together to solve problems. Over the following months, my involvement with the community center became a central focus of my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. I attended weekly staff meetings, helped coordinate fundraising events, recruited volunteers from my church and neighborhood, and spent several afternoons each week tutoring children who needed extra help with reading and math skills. Tommy became my regular companion in this work, accompanying me to the center whenever his schedule allowed, helping younger children with art projects, and serving as a bridge between the kids in the program and my own family's resources. His natural ease with children from different backgrounds and his genuine curiosity about their lives made him an invaluable volunteer despite his young age. "Grandma," he said one day as we drove home from a particularly busy afternoon at the center, "I think this is better than just sending money to people you don't know." His observation reflected a shift in my own thinking about charitable giving, a growing understanding that the most meaningful philanthropy involves relationship and engagement rather than simply financial transactions. "You're right," I agreed. "When you know the people you're helping, when you can see the direct impact of your contributions, it changes the whole experience of giving." The transformation in our family's approach to charity had ripple effects that extended beyond my relationship with Tommy and Sarah. My increased visibility in community volunteer work led to conversations with neighbors and acquaintances who had never known about my charitable activities, creating new connections and inspiring others to become more involved in local causes. Elena Rodriguez became one of my closest collaborators in this work, her experience as a single mother providing valuable insights into the real needs of families served by various programs. Despite her limited financial resources, she contributed time and expertise that proved invaluable, helping to design programming that addressed practical challenges other volunteers might not have understood. "You know," she told me one evening, as we cleaned up after a community center fundraising dinner, "when I first suspected you were the one helping my family anonymously, I was embarrassed. I felt like charity was something that happened to other people, not something I deserved or should need." Her words reminded me of conversations I'd had with other recipients of assistance over the years, the complex emotions that surround receiving help even when it's desperately needed. "What changed your mind?" I asked, genuinely curious about her evolution in thinking about giving and receiving support. "Working here," she said, gesturing around the community center where we'd spent countless hours together over the past few months. "Seeing how we're all just trying to take care of each other, how everybody has something to contribute even if it's not money. I realize now that charity isn't about one person being superior and another being inferior. It's about community." Her insight crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate, the recognition that the most meaningful charitable work creates relationships, rather than simply addressing needs, builds community rather than simply solving problems. That weekend, Sarah joined Tommy and me for a family volunteer day at the community center, her first direct involvement in the work that had become so central to my daily life. Watching her interact with the children and families we served, seeing her natural empathy and practical problem-solving skills in action, I realized how much I'd missed by keeping my charitable activities separate from my family relationships. "Mom," she said as we drove home together, "I'm starting to understand why this work means so much to you. There's something different about helping people face to face, about being part of a solution, rather than just funding it from a distance." Her observation reflected the same realization that had transformed my own approach to giving, the understanding that meaningful philanthropy requires engagement and relationship, rather than simply financial generosity. "I wish I had included you in this work sooner," I told her. "Your skills and perspective would have been valuable, and I think you would have enjoyed being part of these efforts." "Well," Sarah said with a smile, "there's no reason we can't work together now. In fact, I've been thinking about some ways my medical background might be useful for community health programs." Her suggestion opened up new possibilities for family collaboration around charitable work. The prospect of combining our different skills and experiences in service of shared values and common goals. Over the following weeks, we began exploring ways Sarah's nursing expertise could complement my fundraising and organizational abilities, looking for opportunities to address health-related needs in our community. The evolution of our family's approach to charitable giving had created something I hadn't expected when Tommy first asked his innocent question about my apparent poverty. It had generated not just honesty about my financial resources, but genuine collaboration around using those resources to strengthen our community. We had become a team united by shared purpose rather than individuals pursuing separate agendas. 6 months after Tommy's original question, I found myself sitting in the same kitchen where that conversation had begun, but everything felt different. The house looked the same, my possessions remained modest, my lifestyle hadn't changed dramatically. But the secrecy was gone, replaced by openness and shared purpose that had enriched all of our lives in ways I was still discovering. Tommy burst through my back door that afternoon with his usual after-school energy. But instead of heading straight for the refrigerator as he typically did, he made a beeline for the kitchen table where I was working on grant applications for the community center. "Grandma," he announced breathlessly, "I told my teacher about the tutoring program and she wants to bring our whole class to visit and maybe do a service project to help raise money." His excitement was infectious, and I could see in his face the same sense of purpose and engagement that had been transforming my own relationship with charitable work. "That's wonderful," I said, setting aside my paperwork to give him my full attention. "What kind of service project does she have in mind?" "She thought maybe we could have a bake sale or a car wash or something like that," he said, already moving around my kitchen with the energy of someone developing plans. "But I thought maybe we could do something more creative. Something that would teach other kids about why the center is important." His suggestion reflected a sophistication about fundraising and community engagement that impressed me, an understanding that the most effective charitable work involves education and awareness building rather than simply collecting money. "What did you have in mind?" I asked, curious to hear his ideas. "What if we made a presentation about the kids who go to the center?" he suggested, his 8-year-old mind working through possibilities with the same methodical approach he brought to school projects. "We could interview some of them, take pictures of the activities, explain how the program helps families in our community." His proposal demonstrated an intuitive understanding of storytelling as a tool for building empathy and inspiring action, a recognition that people are more likely to support causes when they understand the human impact of their contributions. "I think that's an excellent idea," I told him. "Would you like to work together to develop a plan for that kind of presentation?" Over the next hour, Tommy and I outlined a comprehensive approach to his class service project, incorporating elements of research, interviews, photography, and public speaking that would give his classmates a deep understanding of community needs, while raising both funds and awareness for the tutoring program. As we worked, I found myself marveling at the transformation that had occurred in our family over the past several months. Tommy's innocent question about my apparent poverty had led not just to revelations about my financial situation, but to fundamental changes in how we thought about money, community, and responsibility. We had moved from a dynamic where I gave anonymously while living apparently modestly, to one where we collaborated openly around shared values and common goals. The ripple effects of this transformation continued to surprise me, creating new connections and opportunities that enriched all of our lives in unexpected ways. Sarah had indeed become involved in community health initiatives, using her nursing background to develop wellness programs for families served by various local organizations. Elena had been hired part-time by the community center to coordinate parent engagement activities, turning her volunteer contributions into a small but meaningful source of income for her family. Even more importantly, Tommy had developed a relationship with charitable work that went far beyond simple generosity to encompass genuine understanding of community needs and creative approaches to addressing them. His enthusiasm for service projects had influenced several of his classmates, creating a ripple effect of youth engagement that was already generating new volunteer opportunities and fundraising initiatives. That evening, as I prepared dinner for our family gathering, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. Tommy's question had forced me to examine not just my financial choices, but my approaches to relationship, transparency, and community engagement. The conversation that had begun with his observation about my apparent poverty had evolved into a family commitment to using our resources, both financial and otherwise, in service of values we all shared. Sarah arrived for dinner with news that one of her colleagues at the hospital had expressed interest in volunteering with our community center health initiatives. Dr. Martinez specializes in pediatric care, she explained, and she's looking for ways to do community service that uses her professional skills. Her update represented another example of how our family's increased openness about charitable work had created new opportunities for expanding impact and building connections with like-minded people. The secrecy that had once surrounded my giving had been replaced by collaboration that was generating far more creativity and engagement than I had ever achieved working alone. Tommy set the table with unusual care that evening, arranging napkins and silverware with the attention to detail he typically reserved for important occasions. "This feels different from before," he observed as we gathered around my small dining table. "When it was just a secret about money, it was kind of exciting but also kind of lonely. Now it feels like we're all working on the same team." His insight captured something essential about the transformation our family had experienced. The shift from individual secrecy to collective purpose that had enriched all of our relationships while amplifying our ability to make a meaningful difference in our community. We had discovered that the most rewarding charitable work involves not just financial generosity, but the sharing of time, skills, relationships, and vision in service of goals that extend beyond our own immediate needs and interests. As we finished dinner that evening and Tommy helped me clear the dishes, I realized that his original question about my apparent poverty had led to something far more valuable than simple honesty about money. It had led to authentic collaboration around values, genuine engagement with community needs, and the kind of relationships that give life meaning and purpose beyond individual comfort or security. 1 year later, I stood in the same kitchen where Tommy had asked his life-changing question, but the view from my window had transformed completely. Where once I had seen only my quiet neighborhood, I now witnessed a thriving network of connection and purpose that stretched far beyond what I could have imagined. The community center had doubled its enrollment, serving over 100 children daily. Sarah's health initiatives had expanded into mobile clinics that reached families in 3 neighboring communities. Tommy's class presentation had inspired a district-wide service learning program that engaged hundreds of students in local charitable work. But the most profound change wasn't in the numbers or the programs. It was in the relationships that had grown from seeds of honesty and vulnerability. Tommy burst through my door that afternoon with his usual enthusiasm, but now he carried something different in his eyes. Gone was the innocent curiosity of an 8-year-old trying to understand his grandmother's circumstances. In its place was the confident awareness of a 9-year-old who understood his role in something larger than himself. "Grandma, guess what happened at school today?" he announced, settling beside me at the table where we now did homework together every afternoon. "Mrs. Chen told us about a family whose house burned down, and she asked if our class wanted to help them get back on their feet." I smiled, watching him pull out his notebook with the methodical precision he'd developed over months of working on service projects. "What did you tell her?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "I told her we should visit them first," he said matter-of-factly. "Because you taught me that you can't really help people until you understand what they actually need, not just what you think they need." His response reflected wisdom that had taken me decades to develop, insights about effective charity that he'd absorbed naturally through our shared experiences. I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with academic achievements or athletic accomplishments. The deep satisfaction of knowing that values had been transmitted successfully across generations. That weekend, our family visited the Martinez household, a young couple with 3 children who had lost everything in an electrical fire. What we discovered challenged our assumptions about what disaster relief should look like. Rather than needing immediate handouts, they needed help navigating insurance claims, temporary housing arrangements, and school enrollment procedures for their displaced children. "We don't want charity," Mrs. Martinez told us with quiet dignity as we sat in the bare living room of their temporary apartment. "We want guidance. We want to know how to rebuild our lives in a way that makes us stronger than we were before." Her request resonated deeply with my own philosophy about giving and receiving help. Over the following months, our family became mentors rather than simply donors, helping the Martinez family develop financial literacy skills, connect with career development resources, and build the kind of community support network that prevents future crises from becoming catastrophic. Tommy took particular interest in helping their youngest daughter, Isabella, adjust to her new school. He organized playgroups, included her in birthday parties, and made sure she never felt isolated or different because of her family's temporary hardships. Watching him extend natural kindness to a peer in need showed me that empathy had become instinctive for him, not something he had to consciously remember to practice. Sarah's involvement in the Martinez family's recovery led to her discovery of systematic gaps in social services that affected many families facing unexpected crises. She began advocating for policy changes at the county level, using her medical background and community connections to push for more comprehensive disaster relief protocols. "Mom," she told me one evening as we walked through the neighborhood that had become our shared territory for volunteer work, "I never understood before how much more meaningful it is to work for systemic change rather than just individual assistance." Her observation reflected the same evolution in thinking that had transformed my own approach to charitable giving, the recognition that sustainable impact requires addressing root causes rather than simply treating symptoms. Together, we had learned that the most effective charity involves building capacity rather than creating dependency, fostering independence rather than maintaining need. 6 months after meeting the Martinez family, we attended the housewarming party for their new home. Not a house we had bought for them, but one they had purchased themselves using saving strategies we had helped them develop and credit repair techniques Sarah had researched on their behalf. "This is what success looks like," Mrs. Martinez said as she gave me a tour of their modest but comfortable new space. "Not having someone else solve our problems, but having people believe in our ability to solve them ourselves." Her words encapsulated everything I had hoped to achieve through decades of charitable work, the goal of empowering others rather than simply providing temporary relief. The Martinez family had taught us as much as we had taught them about resilience, dignity, and the difference between help that enables and help that strengthens. Tommy's 9th birthday that year became a celebration not just of his age, but of the person he was becoming. Instead of requesting expensive gifts, he asked friends and family to contribute to a scholarship fund he was establishing for children at the community center who wanted to attend summer enrichment programs but whose families couldn't afford the fees. "I want kids to have opportunities to learn new things and go new places," he explained to the gathered adults, his young voice carrying conviction that impressed everyone present. Because when people have chances to grow and discover what they're good at, they can help other people too. His birthday speech demonstrated understanding about the cyclical nature of opportunity and generosity that I had hoped he would develop but hadn't dared to expect so early in his life. He had internalized the concept that receiving support creates responsibility to extend support to others, that privilege carries obligation to share benefits with those who lack similar advantages. As I looked around my living room that evening, filled with family and friends who had all been touched by our community involvement in various ways, I realized that Tommy's original question had created something none of us could have anticipated. We had become a family united not just by blood, but by shared purpose, connected not just by love, but by common commitment to using our resources in service of values larger than our individual comfort or security. Elena Rodriguez stood near my kitchen counter, laughing with Sarah about a parenting challenge they both recognized from experience. Dr. Martinez chatted with my neighbor about establishing a community garden in the empty lot behind the community center. Tommy sat on the floor with Isabella Martinez and 3 other children from the tutoring program, all of them working together on an art project that would be displayed at the center's upcoming fundraising gala. The scene represented everything I had hoped charitable work could become, but had never experienced during my years of anonymous giving. This was charity as community building, generosity as relationship development, service as mutual enrichment rather than one-directional assistance. Later that evening, after guests had departed and dishes had been washed, Tommy and I sat together on my front porch watching fireflies begin their nightly dance across the lawn. The air was soft with approaching summer, filled with the scents of blooming flowers and fresh possibilities. "Grandma," Tommy said quietly, his voice carrying the reflective tone he used when processing significant thoughts, "remember when I asked you why you were poor?" I smiled in the gathering dusk, remembering that afternoon when his innocent question had shattered my assumptions about privacy and family relationships. "I remember," I said softly. "I think I understand now why you lived the way you did," he continued, swinging his legs from the porch chair that had become his favorite spot for serious conversations. "You weren't poor at all. You were rich in all the ways that actually matter. You just kept it secret until I was old enough to understand what real wealth means." His words settled into my heart like a benediction, confirmation that the values I had tried to model had been received and internalized by the next generation. Tommy had learned not just that money could be used for good, but that the greatest abundance comes from connection, purpose, and the knowledge that your life has contributed to something meaningful beyond your own immediate needs. As we sat together in comfortable silence, watching darkness fall gently across our neighborhood, I understood that his question about my apparent poverty had given us all something invaluable. It had given us honesty instead of secrecy, collaboration instead of isolation, shared purpose instead of individual obligation. Most importantly, it had given us the knowledge that true wealth isn't measured in bank balances, but in relationships nurtured, communities strengthened, and values successfully transmitted to those we love most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.